The teenager rescued the daughter of a businessman at the last second. But when he revealed what he truly wanted in return, the girl's father was left speechless. The summer sun in Phoenix was relentless. Heat waves shimmered above the asphalt, and the air felt like an oven. Ryan walked out of the small apartment, his red lifeguard shirt sticking to his back. The fabric was faded but clean, and it meant a lot to him. He looked back at the apartment building, a worn-down place with cracked walls and neighbors too busy surviving to talk much. Inside, his mom was sitting at the table, bills spread out in front of her, her shoulders heavy with worry. "Ryan, don't forget to eat something at the pool. They have snacks there, right?" she called out. Her voice was tired. "Yeah, they do," Ryan answered, pulling the door closed. He knew she skipped breakfast again, just like yesterday and probably today too. They couldn't afford both of them eating every meal, and she always made sure he got what he needed. Ryan walked the few blocks to Central Park Community Center. The pavement under his feet was scorching, and the shade was scarce. He passed kids in swim trunks and parents pushing strollers. It was early, but he knew the pool would be busy. This was Phoenix. Nobody stayed indoors if they could help it, and the pool was a cheap escape from the heat. He reached the gate, giving a nod to Dan, the head lifeguard. Dan was in his early 20s with a tan that showed he spent way too much time outside. Dan smiled. "Hey, Ryan, ready for another busy day?" Ryan nodded. "Always." Ryan liked being a junior lifeguard. He wasn't officially old enough to save anyone on his own, but Dan had taught him enough to feel like he could handle things if something went wrong. He'd watched hours of CPR demos, spent afternoons practicing how to help people out of the water, and he wore that uniform. Like it was a badge of honor, it gave him purpose, something solid in the chaos that seemed to follow him at home. By the time Ryan was at his station, the pool was filling up. Families sprawled out on blankets. Toddlers in swim diapers wobbled at the edge of the shallow end. He scanned the pool area, his eyes lingering on a little girl in a bright blue onesie. She was toddling around, her babysitter glued to her phone. He'd seen them before, Emma and the babysitter, who never seemed to be paying attention. Ryan frowned. Emma was getting close to the edge. He kept watching, the babysitter oblivious. A lot of people came to this pool, some families well off, some not. Emma's dad was rich. Ryan remembered seeing him drop her off once, driving an expensive car and giving the babysitter a long list of instructions. Ryan always wondered how people could be so comfortable leaving someone else in charge of their kid like that. His own dad left when he was 5, and since then it had been just him and his mom. Ryan didn't have time to think about what-ifs. His job was to keep his eyes on the pool and make sure everyone was safe. That meant Emma, too, even if her babysitter didn't seem to care. "Hey, kiddo!" Dan called, pointing to the deep end where a group of teenagers were getting rowdy. "Keep an eye on those guys, okay?" Ryan nodded, but his eyes flickered back to Emma. She was closer now, her little hands reaching out toward the sparkling blue water. Her babysitter was scrolling through her phone, oblivious to Emma's steps toward danger. Ryan's eyes were fixed on Emma. Her small feet moved closer to the edge, tiny sandals scraping along the pool tiles. The babysitter didn't notice, her head still bent over her phone, fingers swiping. A few seconds passed. Emma stood right at the edge now, wobbling on her toes as she looked down at the shimmering water. Ryan felt his stomach tighten. He called out, "Hey!" hoping the babysitter would hear, but his voice got lost in the chaos of laughter, splashing, and kids shouting. He tried again, louder this time. "Hey, watch her!" No reaction. The babysitter didn't even look up. Ryan's heart pounded faster, and then Emma slipped. Her feet slid off the edge and she tumbled forward into the water. He saw her tiny form vanish beneath the surface, bubbles rising where she had fallen. His breath caught in his throat. Ryan jumped off his chair, his sneakers slamming against the hot concrete. He ran, dodging kids and yelling as he moved, "Out of the way!" but nobody seemed to understand. The babysitter still hadn't looked up, and the pool was too loud. Ryan's heart pounded harder. He could see Emma now just beneath the water, her arms flailing but weak. She was sinking, and the babysitter was only a few feet away, still focused on her phone. "Look up!" Ryan shouted, frustration and fear mingling in his voice. He could see Emma's tiny hands under the water, trying to push herself up, failing each time. He glanced around, hoping someone, anyone, would jump in. But people were frozen, confused, unsure if they were seeing what they thought they were seeing. Some parents were pointing, others whispering, but nobody moved. A few of the older kids had taken out their phones, recording instead of helping. The panic in Ryan's chest grew sharper. "Emma!" Ryan screamed as he reached the edge. He could see her face now, eyes wide, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to breathe. She was just a toddler. She didn't understand what was happening. There was no time left. He pushed the fear down and focused. This was it, the real thing. He didn't have time to think about being scared or messing up. He dove in. The cold water rushed over him, and in an instant, the noise above was gone, replaced by the muted rush of bubbles. He could see her, her small body drifting downward, her eyes beginning to close. He kicked hard, arms reaching out, fingers brushing against her arm. Ryan's lungs burned as he grabbed Emma, pulling her to his chest. He kicked back to the surface, breaking through with a gasp. He pulled Emma's head above water, her face pale, her eyes barely open. He pushed through the water with her in his arms, heading to the edge, each kick feeling heavier as his muscles screamed in protest. When they reached the edge, he struggled to lift her, her small body heavier now, soaked with water. Dan was there. He'd finally noticed. He grabbed Emma and pulled her out of the pool, laying her carefully on the concrete. Ryan heaved himself out after her, panting, dripping wet. People crowded around, staring, some still holding their phones. "Step back," Dan yelled, waving his arms. "Give them space." Ryan dropped to his knees beside Emma. He leaned in, listening for her breathing. Nothing. His hands shook, but he pressed them together and began CPR, just like Dan had taught him. 1 compression, 2 compressions. He tilted her head back, breathed into her tiny mouth. Still nothing. "Come on, Emma. Come on," Ryan whispered, his voice cracking. He pressed again. Another breath. He felt the seconds ticking away, every one of them a weight pressing harder on his chest. Dan knelt beside him, ready to step in, but Ryan didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Finally, Emma's chest jerked. She coughed, sputtering water, her little body shuddering. Ryan let out a long breath, relief washing over him as her eyes opened, tears spilling down her cheeks. She took a shaky breath, then started crying, loud, desperate, frightened. Ryan's hands fell to his sides and he sat back, his own chest rising and falling as he tried to catch his breath. The babysitter finally ran over, eyes wide, her phone forgotten in her pocket. She reached for Emma, but Dan stepped between them, his expression hard. "Where were you?" he demanded. She stammered, looking from Dan to Ryan, her face going pale. Ryan barely noticed. He was still looking at Emma, watching as she reached out and grabbed Dan's shirt, clinging to him as she cried. He felt the adrenaline begin to fade, leaving behind only exhaustion. The people around them began talking, murmuring about what had just happened. The pool felt different now, the laughter and splashing gone, replaced with whispers and tension. Ryan looked up, his eyes meeting Dan's. Dan gave him a small nod, a look of pride and relief in his eyes. "You did good, kid," Dan said quietly, his voice almost drowned out by Emma's sobs. Ryan nodded, his throat tight. He didn't feel like he'd done something amazing. He felt shaky, scared. The fear he had pushed down was rising now, making his stomach twist. He looked at Emma again, her tiny hands still clinging to Dan, and he felt his chest tighten. She was okay. That was all that mattered. Dan stood up, still holding Emma, and Ryan followed, his legs feeling unsteady. The crowd began to disperse, parents pulling their kids closer, some offering Ryan nods of appreciation. He barely noticed them. His eyes stayed on Emma until Dan carried her over to a chair, sitting down with her and talking softly to calm her. The babysitter was still standing there, her hands trembling. Ryan wanted to yell at her, tell her she should have been watching, but he was too tired, and Emma was safe now. That was enough. Ryan turned away, heading back to his lifeguard station. He pulled himself up onto the chair, his body sore, his heart still pounding. He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the pool again. Everything had gone quiet. The kids in the deep end were no longer splashing. The parents were keeping a closer eye on their toddlers. He wiped his face, the water dripping down his chin, and leaned back. The day wasn't over yet. He still had a job to do. "Ryan!" Dan called out, his voice softer now. Ryan looked over. Dan gave him a thumbs up, and Ryan managed a small smile in return. He sat there, watching the pool, and slowly the noise began to pick up again. Laughter, splashes, and the sounds of summer in Phoenix. Ryan kept his eyes on the water, ready for whatever came next. The sun bore down on the community center pool as Ryan sat in his lifeguard chair, still dripping wet from the rescue. His muscles ached, his heart still felt heavy in his chest, but there wasn't any time to rest. Kids were back in the water, laughter rising again as the sense of normalcy returned. It was like everything had gone back to normal for everyone, except Ryan. Emma was safe now, and Dan was holding her on a pool chair, talking softly as her cries subsided. The babysitter hovered a few feet away, wringing her hands. Ryan took a deep breath, trying to push the tension out of his chest. It wasn't working. He looked down at his hands. They were still trembling. His head buzzed with everything that had just happened. The feeling of Emma's tiny body under the water, the seconds ticking by, the sheer weight of the responsibility he'd carried in those moments. A sudden burst of voices near the pool gate caught Ryan's attention. He turned his head and saw a man running, well-dressed, clearly out of place for a pool on a summer afternoon. His face was a mixture of fear and confusion as he looked around, eyes darting past the chairs and the people gathered there. Ryan recognized him immediately. It was Mr. Thompson, Emma's father. Ryan had seen him before, dropping off Emma at the pool, always in a rush. "Emma!" Mr. Thompson called out, his voice cracking with panic. He was scanning the pool area, searching for her. Dan looked up, waved an arm, and the man came rushing over. "Is she okay? What happened?" Mr. Thompson's voice was frantic as he knelt next to the pool chair where Dan was holding Emma. She was still crying, but the intensity had faded to small hiccups. Dan gave a reassuring nod. "She's okay now. There was an accident, but she's safe. Ryan got to her in time." Ryan watched as Mr. Thompson's eyes moved from Dan to Emma, and then finally over to him. The man's eyes were red, like he was holding back tears, and his face softened when he saw Ryan standing by the pool, looking down at them. "You saved her?" he asked, his voice quieter now. He stood up, stepping toward Ryan. Ryan hesitated, unsure what to say. He nodded slowly, feeling a little awkward under the man's intense gaze. Mr. Thompson closed the distance, standing just in front of Ryan. He looked at him for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. Then he spoke, his voice trembling. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here. I can't thank you enough." Ryan nodded again, swallowing hard. The attention felt overwhelming. He was just doing what he was supposed to do, right? That's what he kept telling himself. He glanced at Emma, who was still holding tightly to Dan's shirt. Her eyes met his for a moment, and she managed a weak, tired smile. Ryan returned it, though it felt shaky on his lips. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, his eyes still locked on Ryan. "I need to do something for you. Anything you need, just..." Tell me, all right? You saved my daughter. I have to give something back." Ryan looked away, his eyes dropping to the pool tiles under his feet. He didn't want money or gifts. He didn't even know what to say. But then he thought of his mom. He thought of her sitting at that table, looking at bills, skipping meals just to make sure he was fed. He looked back up at Mr. Thompson, his throat tightening. "My mom," he started, his voice almost too quiet to hear. He cleared it, speaking louder. "My mom, she's been out of work for a while. She's trying, but it's been hard." He hesitated, feeling a strange kind of vulnerability rising in his chest. "If you could help her get a job, something stable, that's all I want." Mr. Thompson blinked, clearly taken aback. He looked at Ryan for a long moment, then nodded slowly, the emotion clear on his face. "Your mom needs a job?" he repeated softly, as if trying to understand the simplicity of the request. He let out a breath, one that seemed to carry the weight of everything that had just happened. "Of course. I'll do whatever I can. She's got a job with me as soon as possible." Ryan felt the tightness in his chest loosen, just a little. He managed another nod, his eyes dropping again, this time out of relief. "Thank you," he murmured, barely audible. Mr. Thompson reached out and patted Ryan's shoulder, then pulled his hand back as if unsure what to do. "You're a good kid, Ryan. Your mom must be proud." Ryan didn't know how to respond to that. He just nodded, biting the inside of his cheek to keep his emotions in check. He didn't feel like some kind of hero. He felt tired, and like maybe he could sleep for a week. He just wanted to see his mom smile without that worry in her eyes. Dan stood up, still holding Emma carefully, and gave Ryan a knowing look. "Why don't you take a break, kid? You've earned it." Ryan hesitated. He looked around the pool, at the parents now holding their kids closer, the lifeguards stationed around the edges, keeping a careful watch. The laughter had returned, but quieter, more cautious. He finally nodded. "Yeah, all right," he said, and climbed down from the lifeguard chair. He gave one last look at Emma, who was nestled against her father now, her tiny fingers holding onto his shirt. Mr. Thompson gave Ryan a nod, a silent promise in his eyes. Ryan turned and walked away from the pool, his feet heavy, his body aching from the adrenaline that had finally begun to fade. Ryan made his way over to the shade, where there were a few benches lined against the wall. He sank down onto one of them, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. He let out a long, shaky breath, feeling the exhaustion washing over him. The heat of the sun was still there, but under the shade it felt bearable, almost comforting. He closed his eyes, just for a second, and let the voices of the pool fade into the background. He thought of his mom, and for the first time in a long while, he imagined her smiling, without the weight of worry on her shoulders. The idea felt good. Ryan opened his eyes again when he heard someone approach. It was Dan. He sat down beside Ryan, handing him a bottle of water. "You really did good today, Ryan," Dan said, his voice steady, calm. "Not everyone can keep their head in a moment like that. You saved her life." Ryan unscrewed the cap on the bottle, taking a long drink before answering. He wiped his mouth, then nodded. "Thanks, Dan," he said quietly. I don't know, I couldn't let her, you know?" Dan nodded, understanding. "Yeah, I know." He paused, then added, "Not everyone steps up when it counts. You did, and that's something to be proud of." Ryan looked at Dan and then out at the pool. The day was still going. The sun was still shining. People were still playing, laughing, living their lives. It was like nothing had happened, but Ryan knew it had. He knew things had changed, maybe more than he realized. Dan stood up, giving Ryan a pat on the back. "Take your time, all right? We've got it covered for now." Ryan nodded again, watching as Dan walked back toward the pool, taking his position at the edge. He looked out at the families, at the kids splashing in the water, and felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He knew there was still a lot ahead. Conversations with his mom, hoping Mr. Thompson would come through on his promise. But for now, this was enough. He leaned back on the bench, closing his eyes again. The summer sun was still blazing, the world still spinning. But for once, Ryan felt like maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. Ryan sat on the bench, resting under the shade, feeling the weight of the day settle in. His body ached, and his mind kept replaying the images of Emma struggling under the water, her tiny face pale and panicked. He tried to push it aside, focusing instead on the feeling that came afterward. Emma breathing again, her cries filling the air, the relief washing over him. It was strange to feel such exhaustion and such a sense of accomplishment at the same time. He glanced up as he saw Mr. Thompson walking over, Emma in his arms, still sniffling, but now calm. Mr. Thompson's face was a mix of emotions: gratitude, relief, exhaustion. He approached Ryan slowly, his steps careful, as if he were afraid Emma might start crying again if he moved too quickly. "Ryan," Mr. Thompson started, his voice softer now, almost unsure. He stopped a few feet away, adjusting Emma in his arms so she could see Ryan too. "I wanted to come over and thank you again. I don't think I can say it enough." Ryan looked up at him, feeling a bit of the awkwardness return. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, and certainly not this level of gratitude. He nodded, offering a small smile. "I'm just glad she's okay," he said. His voice felt small compared to everything that had happened. Mr. Thompson let out a breath, like he had been holding it in since the moment he had arrived at the pool. He looked down at Emma, her tiny hand gripping the collar of his shirt, then back at Ryan. "You did something today that not everyone could do. You saved her life, and I can't imagine what I would have done if you hadn't been here." Ryan nodded again, swallowing hard. The memory of the fear, the urgency, was still fresh in his mind. He didn't know what to say to that, so he just said, "I did what I had to do." Emma looked at Ryan then, her eyes big and still watery, but she managed a small smile. She reached out her hand, her fingers opening and closing as if she wanted Ryan to take it. Ryan hesitated for a moment, then reached out, gently holding her tiny hand for a second. "Thank you," Emma said in a soft voice, her lips trembling a little as she spoke. It wasn't much, but it hit Ryan harder than he expected. He smiled, a real one this time, and nodded. "You're welcome, Emma," he said. He let go of her hand gently, and she went back to clinging to her father, her eyes still on Ryan. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, as if he were trying to regain his composure. He looked at Ryan, his eyes still filled with gratitude. "Listen, Ryan, about what you asked for, about your mom. I meant what I said. I'm going to make sure she gets an opportunity. I'll do everything I can. She deserves it, and so do you." Ryan's heart swelled a little at that. He wanted to believe it, and there was something about the way Mr. Thompson said it that made him think, maybe this time, things could actually change. He nodded, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. "That means a lot." Mr. Thompson gave a small smile, one that seemed to carry both relief and determination. "No, Ryan, thank you. You've given me something I can never repay, but I'm going to try." Ryan didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded again. Mr. Thompson adjusted Emma in his arms and turned to leave, giving Ryan one last look, a nod that felt almost like a promise. Ryan watched as they walked away, Emma looking back at him over her father's shoulder until they disappeared around the corner of the pool area. Ryan leaned back against the bench, letting out a long breath. It felt like some of the weight on his shoulders had lifted, but there was still a lot he couldn't quite shake. The day wasn't over. There was still the thought of going home, telling his mom what had happened, hoping that Mr. Thompson's promise would come through. He looked back at the pool, the water now calm, the kids playing, the parents watching more carefully. It all seemed normal again, but Ryan knew it wasn't. He knew things had shifted, even if only a little bit. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to let the sounds of the pool wash over him, trying to find some sense of calm. He heard footsteps again, and when he opened his eyes, Dan was standing in front of him, a bottle of water in one hand and a smile on his face. "Hey, kid," Dan said, holding out the bottle. "Thought you might need this." Ryan took it, nodding. "Thanks," he said, twisting off the cap and taking a long drink. The water was cool, refreshing, and it helped steady him a little. Dan sat down next to him, letting out a sigh as he stretched his legs out in front of him. "You know, I've seen a lot of people panic in situations like that," Dan said after a moment. "They freeze, they freak out, they do everything but what they're supposed to do. You didn't. You kept it together and you saved her. That's not something everyone can do." Ryan looked at Dan, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. He nodded, though he didn't quite know what to say. I don't know. I saw her and I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there." Dan smiled, a proud look in his eyes. "Exactly. And that's what makes the difference, Ryan. You stepped up when it mattered most. That's something you should be proud of." Ryan felt a small warmth in his chest at that. He nodded again, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Thanks, Dan," he said quietly. Dan patted him on the shoulder, then stood up, stretching. "Take it easy for a while, all right? We've got things covered here. You've done more than enough today." Ryan watched as Dan walked back toward the pool, taking his place at the edge, scanning the water like always. Ryan stayed on the bench for a few more minutes, drinking his water, letting the exhaustion slowly fade into a quieter kind of tiredness. He knew he'd be thinking about today for a long time, replaying the moment when he jumped in, the moment Emma started breathing again. It was all still so vivid, but there was also a sense of closure now, like he had done something that mattered, something real. Ryan finally stood up, stretching his arms over his head. He looked at the pool one last time, then turned and walked toward the entrance gate. He knew his shift wasn't technically over, but Dan had told him to take a break, and right now, that's exactly what he needed. He pushed the gate open and stepped out onto the hot pavement, the heat of the sun washing over him again. The walk home was short, but it felt longer today. Each step was heavy, his legs still aching from the rush of adrenaline and the effort of pulling Emma from the water. But there was also a lightness in his chest now, a sense that maybe things were going to change. Maybe Mr. Thompson would help his mom, and maybe they wouldn't have to struggle so much anymore. When Ryan finally reached his apartment, he paused at the door, taking a deep breath before pushing it open. He stepped inside, the cool air hitting him, and he saw his mom at the table, the bills still spread out, her shoulders slumped. She looked up, her eyes widening when she saw him, still in his wet lifeguard uniform. "Ryan, what happened?" she asked, concern filling her voice as she stood up. Ryan smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "I've got a story to tell you, Mom," he said, closing the door behind him. He walked over to her, pulling out a chair and sitting down across from her. "But first, I think things are going to get better. I met someone today and he promised to help." His mom looked at him, confusion and hope mingling in her eyes. "Help? What do you mean?" Ryan nodded, his smile growing a little. "Just trust me, okay? I think things are finally going to change." His mom's eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table, taking his hand. "I trust you, Ryan," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I trust you." Ryan squeezed her hand, the weight on his chest lifting a little more. Maybe today had been the hardest day of his life, but it was also the day that things started to change. For both of them. Ryan sat at the table with his mom, their hands still linked across the pile of overdue bills and envelopes. The weight of everything that had happened today still pressed on him, but there was a strange sense of hope that hadn't been there before. He took a deep breath, looked at his mom, and began to explain everything. I was at the pool today, and this little girl, Emma, you know, the one with the babysitter who's always on her phone. Ryan paused. His mom nodded, concern still etched in her eyes. She fell in, Mom. She went under, and I had to jump in and get her out. His mom's face went pale, her eyes widening as she squeezed his hand tighter. Oh my God, Ryan. Is she okay? Are you okay? Ryan nodded. Yeah, she's okay. I got her out just in time. It was scary, but I did it. I did what I had to do. He paused, then added softly, and I'm okay too. She let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for too long, her eyes misty as she looked at her son. You saved her life? Ryan shrugged a little, feeling awkward under her gaze. Yeah, I guess I did. His mom blinked back tears, her voice breaking. I'm so proud of you, Ryan. So proud. She reached out, pulling him into a hug, holding him tightly. Ryan closed his eyes, resting his head on her shoulder. It felt good, the warmth of her embrace, the reassurance that he had done something right. There's more, Ryan said, pulling back gently, looking at her. Afterwards, her dad showed up. Mr. Thompson, he's rich. He asked what he could do to thank me, and I told him about you. Ryan paused, watching the emotions flicker across her face. I told him you've been looking for a job, and he said he'd help. He promised to give you a chance. His mom's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of hope. She looked at him, her lips parting in surprise. He said that? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Ryan nodded, a small smile forming. Yeah, he did. He said he wants to help. He said you deserve a chance. I think he's serious, Mom. For a moment she was silent, her gaze dropping to the bills on the table. Her hands shook as she reached out, touching one of the envelopes. It's been so hard, Ryan, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. I've tried so hard to make things work, and I just want to be able to give you the life you deserve. Ryan squeezed her hand, shaking his head. You've done everything you could, Mom. I know that. And maybe now things will get better. Maybe we'll get that chance. She nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, her lips trembling as she tried to smile. I don't know what to say. I didn't think anything like this could happen. Ryan gave a small laugh, shaking his head. Honestly, I didn't either. But here we are. He looked at her, his eyes earnest. Just promise me you'll take the chance, okay? If he really offers it, promise me you'll go for it. She looked at him, her eyes softening, and nodded slowly. I promise, Ryan. I'll take the chance. The next day, Ryan woke up early. His mom had an energy about her that hadn't been there in months. She'd put on her nicest clothes, the ones she used to wear to her old job before everything had fallen apart. She had done her hair, and she looked like the version of herself Ryan remembered from before, the one who smiled more often, whose eyes were bright and hopeful. Do I look okay? She asked, standing in front of the mirror, turning slightly to check herself from every angle. Ryan smiled, nodding. You look great, Mom. He'll see how amazing you are. She gave him a smile, one that was still tinged with nerves. I'm nervous, Ryan. I haven't been to an interview in so long. You've got this, Ryan said firmly. You've always taken care of everything. This is just another thing, and you're going to nail it. She looked at him, her eyes softening again, and nodded. Thank you, Ryan. I don't know what I'd do without you. Later that morning, Mr. Thompson showed up. He was dressed in a crisp suit, his demeanor polite but with a warmth that made Ryan feel like he genuinely meant what he'd said. He shook Ryan's mom's hand, introducing himself properly, and they spoke quietly for a few minutes. Ryan stood off to the side, watching, his chest swelling with hope. "Mrs. Henderson," Mr. Thompson said after a bit, "why don't you come by my office today? We can talk about a position that might be a good fit for you." Ryan watched as his mom nodded, her voice steady as she accepted. He could see the relief in her eyes, the way her shoulders seemed to drop just a little, as if some of the weight she'd been carrying for so long had been lifted, even if only slightly. The hours that followed felt long. Ryan waited at home, pacing the small apartment, checking the clock again and again. He kept thinking about the pool, about the moment he saw Emma go under, and how everything had changed in an instant. He remembered how scared he'd been, but also how sure he was that he had to do something. That same feeling was there now, that strange mix of fear and hope. When his mom finally came back, she walked in with a smile, a real one, bright and genuine. Ryan looked up from the couch, his heart jumping into his throat. "Well?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I got it, Ryan, I got the job." Ryan jumped up, crossing the room in an instant to hug her, holding her tightly. He felt her shoulders shake as she cried, and he felt his own tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. "You did it, Mom," he whispered. "You did it." "No," she said, her voice cracking as she pulled back to look at him. "You did this, Ryan. You made this happen." He shook his head, but she wouldn't hear it. She smiled through her tears, cupping his face with her hands. "I'm so proud of you. You're the reason we have this chance." Ryan swallowed hard, his vision blurring. He nodded, not trusting his voice. He pulled her into another hug, holding her tightly. In that moment, everything felt different. The weight of all the hard times, the struggles, the fear. It all seemed to ease, replaced by something new. Hope. The days that followed were a whirlwind. His mom started her new job, and each day she came home, she looked more and more like herself. She talked about the people she worked with, about the things she was learning, about the future in a way that felt bright and open. Ryan loved seeing it. He loved seeing her happy. And for Ryan, life at the pool continued. He still wore his red lifeguard uniform, still climbed into his chair, still watched the water for any sign of trouble. But now, there was a sense of pride that hadn't been there before. He knew what he was capable of. He knew that when it mattered, he could do the right thing. One day, as he stood by the pool, watching the kids splashing and laughing, he heard a voice behind him. "Ryan!" It was Mr. Thompson, standing at the gate holding Emma's hand. She looked shyly at Ryan, her face breaking into a smile as soon as she saw him. "Hey, Mr. Thompson," Ryan said, smiling at Emma. "Hey, Emma." Mr. Thompson opened the gate, walking over. He knelt down beside Emma, nodding to Ryan. She wanted to come by and say hello. Emma looked up at her father, then at Ryan, her cheeks a little pink. "Hi, Ryan," she said softly, holding out a small piece of paper. Ryan took it, his heart swelling as he looked at the drawing. It was him, in his lifeguard chair, with Emma beside him, smiling. He looked back at her, his throat tight. "Thank you, Emma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's beautiful." Emma nodded, her eyes bright as she smiled. Mr. Thompson stood, resting a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "We'll never forget what you did, Ryan," he said. "You'll always be a hero to us." Ryan nodded, feeling the warmth spread through his chest, the pride that came with knowing he had made a difference. "Thank you, sir," he said. He looked at Emma, smiling at her again. "Thank you, Emma." She gave a little wave, and Mr. Thompson nodded, leading her away. Ryan watched them go, his heart feeling full, his mind quiet and content. Ryan turned back to the pool, the sun shining down, the laughter echoing around him. Everything felt right again, like things had finally clicked into place. He took a deep breath, smiling as he climbed back into his lifeguard chair, eyes on the water, ready for whatever came next. Ryan's mom's new job had changed everything in just a matter of days. She woke up early, put on her new work clothes, and left for Mr. Thompson's office downtown. When she came home, her face was flushed from the heat, but there was something else too, an energy that Ryan hadn't seen in a long time. She seemed lighter, and the tiredness in her eyes had faded into something more hopeful. For Ryan, life at the pool went on, but now it felt different. He felt a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. He still woke up to the blazing sun, walked the cracked streets to the community center, and watched over the kids from his high lifeguard chair. But there was a kind of pride that came with the uniform now. He wasn't just a kid watching the water. He was someone who had made a difference. Ryan leaned back in his chair, watching the pool area fill up as the sun climbed higher. Kids were already in the water, splashing, laughing, their parents sitting in the shade nearby. He scanned the crowd, keeping an eye on everyone, just like he always did. "Hey, Ryan," Dan called, walking over to the base of the chair. "Busy day, huh?" Ryan nodded, smiling down at Dan. "Yeah, it's starting to get that way. School's out, so everyone's trying to escape the heat." Dan chuckled, pushing his sunglasses up on his head. "Well, you're doing great. Everyone's still talking about what you did for Emma, you know. You're kind of a local legend now." Ryan shook his head, feeling his cheeks warm. "Nah, I just did what anyone would have done." Dan gave him a look, smiling knowingly. "Not anyone, kid. You stepped up. That's different." Ryan shrugged, glancing back at the pool. The truth was, he still didn't feel like a hero. He'd done what needed to be done, and that was all. But hearing people talk about it, seeing the way Dan looked at him, it made something in his chest swell with pride. Maybe he had done something that mattered after all. Suddenly there was a commotion near the gate. Ryan looked over and saw Mr. Thompson walking in, dressed in his usual business attire, and his mom beside him, smiling. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to see her here, not during the day. She waved, her eyes bright, and Ryan climbed down from his chair, hurrying over. "Mom," he called, his voice breaking into a smile. She waved again, and Ryan saw Mr. Thompson give him a nod, his face warm. "Hey, Ryan," his mom said, reaching out to pull him into a hug. She squeezed him tight, then stepped back, her hands resting on his shoulders. "I wanted to come by and see you at work. Mr. Thompson was kind enough to bring me." Ryan looked from her to Mr. Thompson, a question in his eyes. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice quiet, unsure. Mr. Thompson smiled, nodding. "More than okay, Ryan. Your mom's been doing great. We're lucky to have her. Today we just thought we'd take a moment to come by and see you, and maybe talk about something." Ryan raised an eyebrow, confused but curious. "Talk about what?" His mom smiled, her eyes shining with excitement. "Mr. Thompson wants to offer you something, Ryan, an opportunity." Ryan looked at Mr. Thompson, the confusion deepening. "An opportunity?" Mr. Thompson nodded, his face serious now, though still warm. "Ryan, I've seen how you are here at the pool. You've got a talent for this. You're responsible. You've got good instincts, and you care about people. I want to offer you a chance to work with my company. It wouldn't be as a lifeguard, of course, but it's a position where you could learn some new skills, help out with the administrative side of things." Ryan blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. He looked at his mom, her face full of hope, then back at Mr. Thompson. "Wait, you want me to work for you?" he asked, his voice full of disbelief. Mr. Thompson smiled. "That's right. You'd start as an assistant, helping out in the office, learning how things work. It's not a full-time thing. You could still work here at the pool in the summer if you want. But it'd be a way for you to get some experience and maybe set you on a path to something more." Ryan was stunned. He looked at his mom, then back at Mr. Thompson, feeling the weight of the offer, the magnitude of it. "I don't know what to say," he finally managed. "I mean, I'd love to, but I don't know if I'm ready for something like that. His mom squeezed his shoulder, her smile gentle. You're ready, Ryan. You're more ready than you think. And this is a chance for you to start building something for yourself, to show everyone what you're capable of. Ryan looked back at Mr. Thompson, swallowing hard. Are you sure? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. I mean, I'm just a kid. I don't know anything about working in an office. Mr. Thompson nodded, his eyes kind. I'm sure. And you're not just a kid, Ryan. You're someone who steps up when it matters. That's what we need. Everything else, you can learn. Ryan felt his heart pounding in his chest, a mixture of fear and excitement swirling inside him. He nodded slowly, a smile breaking through. Okay, he said. Yeah, I'll do it. His mom let out a small laugh, her eyes glistening with tears. She hugged him again, tighter this time. I'm so proud of you, Ryan, she whispered, her voice trembling. Mr. Thompson extended a hand, and Ryan shook it, feeling the firmness of the man's grip, the warmth of his smile. Welcome aboard, Ryan. We'll make sure you've got everything you need. Just be ready to learn, all right? Ryan nodded, his mind still spinning. I will. I'll do my best. They stayed for a while longer, talking about the details, about when Ryan would start and what he could expect. His mom's face was glowing, and Ryan felt the pride welling up in his chest again. This was real. This was a real chance to change things, to make a future for himself and for his mom. Eventually, Mr. Thompson had to leave, and Ryan's mom gave him one last hug before she followed, leaving Ryan standing by the pool, his heart still racing. He watched them go, feeling a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. Hey, Ryan! Dan's voice broke through his thoughts, and Ryan turned to see Dan standing by his lifeguard chair, his arms crossed. What was that all about? Ryan walked back over, a grin spreading across his face. I think I just got a job, he said, the excitement finally bubbling over. Dan raised an eyebrow, smiling. A job? What kind of job? Ryan shrugged, the grin not fading. Mr. Thompson offered me a position at his company. It's just an assistant thing, but it's something. Dan let out a low whistle, nodding in approval. Look at you, moving up in the world. That's pretty awesome, Ryan. Ryan climbed back up into his lifeguard chair, looking out over the pool, feeling a new sense of purpose settle in. Yeah, it is, he said, his voice quiet but full of excitement. He took a deep breath, letting the feeling of hope wash over him. The pool stretched out in front of him, the sun sparkling off the water, the laughter of the kids ringing in his ears. For the rest of the day, Ryan stayed in his chair, watching the pool, feeling like things were finally falling into place. It was just one small step, but it was a step forward, and that was more than enough for now. As the sun began to set, the pool slowly emptied out, parents calling their kids, gathering towels and bags, heading home. Ryan climbed down from his chair, his body sore from the long day but his heart light. He knew there was a lot ahead of him, a lot to learn, a lot of challenges, but he was ready. He was ready to take the next step, to build something real for himself and for his mom. Dan walked over as Ryan gathered his things, clapping a hand on his shoulder. You know, I think you've got a pretty bright future ahead of you, kid. Ryan smiled, nodding. Thanks, Dan. I think so, too. He walked out of the pool area, the cool evening air wrapping around him as he made his way home. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks, but the light was still bright enough to see the way ahead. Ryan knew there were still challenges to face, still struggles ahead. But now, for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a chance, and he was ready to take it. Ryan sat on the edge of his bed that morning, staring down at the clothes laid out for him. A button-down shirt, neatly ironed by his mom, and a pair of clean jeans. It wasn't much, but it felt like something different. This wasn't his lifeguard uniform or the worn t-shirts he usually wore. Today, it was about making a good impression. Today was his first day as an assistant at Mr. Thompson's company. His mom walked past his room, pausing in the doorway. She had a mug of coffee in her hand, her hair neatly pulled back. She looked proud, the kind of pride that made Ryan feel both nervous and excited. She gave him an encouraging smile. "You look great, Ryan. You're going to do great too," she said, her voice full of warmth. Ryan looked up, managing a smile. "Thanks, Mom. It's just weird, you know? I've never worked in an office before." She walked in, setting her mug down on his dresser, and knelt in front of him, her hands resting on his knees. "Listen, you're going to learn as you go. You're smart, you're hardworking, and you care. That's all you need. The rest will come with time." Ryan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. It was a lot. Going from watching kids in a pool to working in an office. He was stepping into a world he knew nothing about, but his mom's words made it feel possible. He stood up, pulling on his shirt, buttoning it up slowly, feeling each button like a step toward something new. He walked with his mom to the bus stop that morning. They took the same bus, her stop coming up first. She gave him a hug as she stood to get off, whispering, "I'm proud of you," before she made her way to the front. Ryan sat there, staring out the window as the bus rattled through the streets of Phoenix, feeling the nervousness knotting in his stomach. Eventually, his stop came, and he stood, taking a deep breath before stepping off the bus. The office building was just a block away, a big glass-fronted building that seemed out of place in his life. He walked up to the entrance, feeling dwarfed by its size. The doors opened automatically, and he stepped inside, feeling the rush of cool air wash over him. The lobby was polished and sleek, people walking back and forth, their shoes clicking on the shiny tiles. Ryan hesitated, looking around, unsure of where to go. He spotted a reception desk and walked over, clearing his throat. "Hi, I'm Ryan Henderson. It's my first day here," he said, his voice a little shaky. The receptionist, a woman with glasses and a kind smile, nodded. "Of course, Ryan. Welcome. Mr. Thompson told us you'd be starting today. Let me get someone to show you around." A few minutes later, a young man appeared, mid-20s, with a friendly face and a sharp suit. He extended a hand. "Hey, Ryan. I'm Chris. I'm going to be helping you get settled today." Ryan shook his hand, trying to keep his nerves in check. "Nice to meet you, Chris." Chris led him through the office, pointing out the different departments, introducing him to a few people. Everything seemed to move so quickly. Phones ringing, people typing, conversations happening all around. It was overwhelming, but in a strange way, it was exciting too. Ryan had never been in a place like this before. It was different from the pool, from the quiet of his home. It was busy, full of energy, full of people who seemed to know exactly what they were doing. Chris finally led Ryan to a small desk near the back of the office. It had a computer, a few notepads, and a phone. "This is your spot, Ryan," Chris said, smiling. "You'll be helping out with a little bit of everything, filing, answering phones, running errands. Nothing too crazy, but it's important stuff. It keeps everything running smoothly." Ryan nodded, taking it all in. He sat down at the desk, running his hand over the smooth surface, the feel of it strange and unfamiliar. He looked up at Chris, his voice a little shaky. "I'm not going to lie. I'm a little nervous." Chris laughed, nodding. "That's totally normal, man. I was nervous my first day too. You'll get the hang of it. Just take it one step at a time. And if you need anything, just ask. We're all here to help." Ryan nodded, feeling a bit of the tension ease. He looked at the computer screen, the company logo displayed across it, and took a deep breath. He could do this. He'd jumped into a pool to save a life. He could handle filing some papers and answering a few phones. The first couple of hours passed in a blur. Chris showed Ryan how to use the phone system, how to enter data into the computer, and where to find all the files he might need. There were a few times when Ryan felt lost, his hands fumbling over the keyboard, his mind struggling to keep up. But Chris was patient, always there to step in and guide him through it. Around noon, Ryan took a break, heading to the small kitchen area to grab a bottle of water. He leaned against the counter, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the cool water soothe his dry throat. It was a lot, but it was a good kind of challenge. He felt like he was learning something new, like he was really building toward something. He heard footsteps, and when he looked up, Mr. Thompson was standing in the doorway, a smile on his face. "Hey, Ryan," he said, walking over. "How's your first day going?" Ryan stood up straighter, nodding. "It's going good. A lot to learn, but I think I'm getting it." Mr. Thompson nodded, his smile widening. "That's good to hear. I knew you'd do well. Chris told me you're picking things up fast." He paused, his eyes softening a little. "You know, Ryan, I didn't just bring you in here because of what you did for Emma. I mean, that was incredible, but it's more than that. I see something in you. You've got a good head on your shoulders, and I think you've got a lot of potential." Ryan swallowed, feeling a warmth spread in his chest. "Thank you, sir. I'm going to do my best." Mr. Thompson nodded, resting a hand on Ryan's shoulder. "That's all I ask. Just keep learning. Keep working hard. You've got a bright future ahead of you, Ryan." Mr. Thompson turned to leave, and Ryan watched him go, feeling the words sink in. It was strange being here, being in a place like this, but for the first time it felt right. He felt like he belonged. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Ryan answered phones, filed documents, ran an errand or two. By the end of the day, his head was spinning, his body tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from doing something worthwhile. As he packed up to leave, Chris walked over, giving him a smile. "Hey, you survived your first day. Not bad, huh?" Ryan laughed, nodding. "Yeah, I guess I did." Chris patted him on the shoulder. "You did good, Ryan. I'll see you tomorrow, all right?" Ryan nodded, grabbing his backpack and slinging it over his shoulder. He walked out of the building, the setting sun casting long shadows across the street. The air was still warm, but there was a coolness coming in with the evening. He walked to the bus stop, feeling the weight of the day, the exhaustion mixed with a sense of pride. He got home a little after his mom, and she was waiting for him in the kitchen, a smile on her face. "How'd it go?" she asked, her eyes bright. Ryan smiled back, setting his backpack down and pulling out a chair. "It was good, Mom. It was a lot, but I think I'm gonna like it there." She nodded, her eyes misty as she looked at him. "I knew you would. I'm so proud of you, Ryan." He sat down, leaning back in the chair, letting out a long breath. "Thanks, Mom. I'm proud of you, too. We're both making it happen, huh?" She laughed, nodding, wiping at her eyes. "Yeah, we are." They sat there for a while, talking about their days, sharing the small victories that felt so big to them. For the first time in a long while, there was hope in their home, a sense that maybe things were finally turning around. Ryan went to bed that night, his body sore from the day, his mind tired, but his heart full. He knew there was still so much to learn, so much to do, but he was ready. He had his mom by his side, and he had people who believed in him. And for the first time, he believed in himself too. The weeks that followed Ryan's first day at the office felt like a blur. The routine was new, but comforting. He woke up early, put on his best clothes, and took the bus downtown. Each morning, his mom would share a smile with him before they went their separate ways, her to her own desk, and him to his. The bus ride was their shared moment, a quiet time of calm before the day's work began. Ryan enjoyed these moments, the connection between them growing stronger, like they were finally in sync again. At the office, Ryan had quickly found his rhythm. He got used to the click of keyboards, the hum of printers, the sound of phones ringing in the background. Chris was always there if Ryan had questions, but gradually, Ryan began needing less and less help. He started to understand how everything worked, the filing system, the schedules, even how to interact with the clients who called in. Ryan's favorite part of the job, though, was the unexpected visits from Mr. Thompson. Every now and then, Mr. Thompson would stop by Ryan's desk, checking in to see how things were going, sometimes offering a few words of encouragement. Ryan appreciated that. It made him feel valued, like he was truly part of the team. One afternoon, Mr. Thompson walked over to Ryan's desk, a smile on his face and Emma by his side. Her tiny hand was wrapped around her dad's fingers, her face lighting up the moment she saw Ryan. "Hi, Ryan," she said excitedly, her voice carrying across the office. Ryan looked up from his computer, his face breaking into a smile. "Hey, Emma." He stood up, coming around the desk to kneel in front of her. "How are you doing?" Emma nodded vigorously, her eyes sparkling. "I'm good. I wanted to come see you." Mr. Thompson smiled down at her, then looked at Ryan. "She's been asking to come by all day. Thought we'd stop in while we were in the neighborhood." Ryan glanced up at Mr. Thompson, then back to Emma. "Well, I'm glad you came by," he said, smiling. "You keeping your dad out of trouble?" Emma giggled, nodding, her little face full of pride. "Yes." Ryan chuckled, then glanced at Mr. Thompson. "Thanks for bringing her by. It's good to see her." Mr. Thompson gave Ryan a warm smile. "It's good to see you too, Ryan. I wanted to catch up with you anyway." He gestured to the hallway leading to the conference rooms. "Do you have a minute? I'd like to chat." Ryan nodded, his curiosity piqued. He stood up, glancing at Emma. "You gonna be okay for a minute?" Emma gave a solemn nod, then hugged her dad's leg as if to show she was perfectly fine. Mr. Thompson chuckled, then led Ryan down the hallway, away from the bustle of the main office. They stepped into a small conference room, the door closing behind them. Mr. Thompson gestured for Ryan to take a seat, then sat across from him. He folded his hands on the table, his expression more serious now, though still kind. "Ryan, I want to talk to you about something important," Mr. Thompson began. "I've been watching how you've been doing here, and I'm impressed. You've picked things up quickly, you work hard, and you've got a good attitude. You're exactly the kind of person we need here." Ryan shifted in his seat, feeling a mixture of pride and nervousness. "Thank you, sir. I really appreciate that." Mr. Thompson nodded, his expression softening. "I want to offer you more responsibility, Ryan. I think you're ready for it. It won't be a full-time role just yet, but I'd like you to start learning some of the managerial tasks, working more directly with me, shadowing some of the meetings, and really getting a sense of how the business runs." Ryan's eyes widened. He wasn't expecting this, at least, not so soon. "Shadowing you, you mean like learning how to do what you do?" Mr. Thompson nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Exactly. You're young, Ryan, but I see something in you. You've got a lot of potential, and I want to help you grow. If you're willing to learn, I'm willing to teach." Ryan felt his throat tighten, a mix of excitement and fear bubbling up inside him. This was an opportunity he hadn't even dared to imagine. It was one thing to be an assistant, to help out where he could, but to actually learn from Mr. Thompson himself? That was something entirely different. "I don't know what to say," Ryan managed, his voice almost a whisper. He took a deep breath, looking up at Mr. Thompson. "I'd be honored, sir. I'll do whatever it takes." Mr. Thompson smiled, nodding. "That's what I like to hear, Ryan. We'll start slow, ease you into it. But I think you're ready." Ryan nodded, his heart pounding. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." Mr. Thompson stood, patting Ryan on the shoulder. "I know you won't. You've already proven that. Now let's get back to Emma before she decides to take over the office, huh?" Ryan chuckled, standing up as well. "Yeah, let's not risk that." They returned to the main office, and Emma's face lit up when she saw Ryan. She let go of her dad's leg, running over to him and hugging his knees. Ryan laughed, kneeling down to her level. "You're still here, huh?" he teased, ruffling her hair. Emma nodded, her eyes wide. "Can we go get ice cream now, Daddy?" she asked, looking up at her father. Mr. Thompson smiled, nodding. "Yeah, I think it's about that time." He looked at Ryan. "You want to join us, Ryan? You deserve a break." Ryan hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Yeah, I'd like that." They walked out of the building together, Ryan walking beside Mr. Thompson and Emma holding her father's hand. The afternoon sun was still bright, the heat pressing down on them. But there was a sense of peace in the air. They found a small ice cream shop a few blocks away, the kind of place that had a few tables out front under an awning. They each got their ice cream, Emma's with rainbow sprinkles, of course, and sat down together. Ryan watched Emma carefully scoop her ice cream, her face full of concentration, as if getting the perfect spoonful was the most important thing in the world. Mr. Thompson smiled at her, then looked at Ryan. "You know, Ryan," Mr. Thompson said after a moment, "Emma talks about you all the time. She thinks you're a hero." Ryan looked at Emma, her attention completely absorbed in her dessert, then back at Mr. Thompson, his cheeks warming. "I'm just glad she's okay, sir. That's all that matters to me." Mr. Thompson nodded, his expression soft. "It does matter, and you saved her. But it's more than that. You've made a connection with her, one that means a lot, and not just to her, to me too." Ryan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Mr. Thompson's words. It was strange to think about, how one moment, one decision, had changed everything. Not just for Emma, but for Ryan and his mom too. He felt his throat tighten, and he nodded. "Thank you, sir. I just did what I had to do." Mr. Thompson smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "Sometimes that's all it takes, Ryan. Just doing what you have to do. And because you did, things are different. Better." Ryan looked at Emma, her face now covered in a mix of ice cream and sprinkles. He laughed, shaking his head. "She's a good kid." Mr. Thompson nodded, his gaze softening. "She is. And she's lucky to have someone like you looking out for her." They finished their ice cream, the sun beginning to dip lower in the sky. Mr. Thompson stood, helping Emma up from her chair. "We should get going. But Ryan, thank you for today, and for agreeing to take on more responsibility. I'm excited to see where this goes." Ryan nodded, standing as well. "Me too, sir. I'll work hard, I promise." Mr. Thompson extended his hand, and Ryan shook it firmly, feeling the strength in Mr. Thompson's grip and the confidence behind it. They parted ways at the corner, Mr. Thompson and Emma heading toward their car, Ryan back to the bus stop. On the ride home, Ryan couldn't help but think about how much things had changed. A few weeks ago, he was just a kid trying to help his mom keep the lights on, watching over the pool, wondering if things would ever get better. And now, here he was, working in an office, getting ready to learn from a man like Mr. Thompson, making a future for himself that seemed bright and full of possibility. He got off the bus at his stop, walking the familiar path back to his apartment. When he opened the door, he found his mom in the kitchen, humming to herself as she prepared dinner. She looked up, her eyes brightening when she saw him. "Hey, how was work?" she asked, her smile wide. Ryan smiled back, setting his bag down by the door. "It was good. Mr. Thompson asked me to take on more responsibility. He wants me to start learning the managerial side of things." His mom paused, her eyes widening. "Really? Ryan, that's incredible." She hurried over, pulling him into a hug, her arms tight around him. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. Ryan hugged her back, closing his eyes for a moment. "Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have done it without you." She pulled back, looking at him, her eyes misty. "We're making it, Ryan. We're really making it." Ryan nodded, his heart full. Yeah, Mom, we are. They sat down together for dinner, talking about their day, about the little things that made up their new life. The worries that had once weighed them down were gone, replaced with hope, with excitement, with a future that felt bright and full of promise. Ryan went to bed that night, his body tired but his heart light. He thought about Mr. Thompson's words, about Emma, about his mom. He thought about the journey they'd been on, the struggles they had faced together, and the way they were finally coming out on the other side. For the first time in a long while, Ryan felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The next few months were transformative for Ryan and his mom. Life moved at a pace that was both exhilarating and demanding. Ryan's responsibilities at Mr. Thompson's company expanded steadily. He now spent part of his day shadowing Mr. Thompson, sitting in on meetings, observing the way decisions were made. It was unlike anything Ryan had experienced before, an inside view into the world of business that fascinated and challenged him every day. His mom, meanwhile, was flourishing in her role at the company. She was becoming a key part of the office team, and the glow of happiness and purpose on her face was something Ryan hadn't seen in years. She would come home with stories of her own, small triumphs at work, moments that made her proud of herself again. Ryan cherished those conversations, knowing how far they'd come to get to this point. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Mr. Thompson called Ryan into his office. Ryan was nervous, unsure of what to expect, but he knew enough now to be ready for anything. Mr. Thompson waved him in with a smile, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Take a seat, Ryan," Mr. Thompson said, his voice as warm as always. Ryan sat down, watching as Mr. Thompson folded his hands on the desk, a look of thoughtfulness crossing his features. After a moment, he looked up at Ryan, his eyes steady. "Ryan, I've been thinking about your progress here," he started, leaning back slightly in his chair. "You've come a long way in a very short time, and I don't think I tell you enough just how impressed I am with your dedication." Ryan felt a mix of pride and nervousness. He managed a small smile. "Thank you, sir. I'm really grateful for everything you've done for me." Mr. Thompson nodded, then smiled. "I believe in rewarding hard work, Ryan, and I think you're ready for a bigger role. I want to bring you on officially, not just as a part-time assistant, but as a junior staff member. You'll have a salary, benefits, and more responsibilities. It's a big step, but I think you're ready for it." Ryan blinked, the words sinking in slowly. A salary, benefits, a real, official role. His heart pounded, and for a moment, he was at a loss for words. This was what he had dreamed of. Something solid, something that wasn't just a temporary patch on a struggling life, but a true foundation. He cleared his throat, his voice a little shaky. I don't know what to say. I mean, yes, I'd love that. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." Mr. Thompson smiled, a look of pride crossing his face. "I know you won't, Ryan. You've shown me that time and time again. This is just the beginning for you." Ryan nodded, still processing it all. "Thank you. I'll work as hard as I can. I promise." Mr. Thompson stood, extending his hand, and Ryan shook it, feeling the gravity of the moment. This was a real turning point. Ryan stood up, still feeling the adrenaline rushing through him, and made his way back to his desk, his mind buzzing with excitement. He wished his mom were here so he could tell her right away. That evening, when Ryan got home, his mom was already there preparing dinner. He walked in, barely able to contain the grin that spread across his face. "Mom, you're not going to believe this," he said, dropping his bag and walking over to her. She turned, a curious smile on her face. "What happened?" Ryan took a deep breath, then said, "Mr. Thompson offered me a real job today, not just part-time, like an actual position, salary, benefits, everything." Her eyes widened, and she put down the spoon she was holding, rushing over to hug him. "Ryan, that's incredible." She squeezed him tightly, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I'm so proud of you. You've worked so hard for this." Ryan hugged her back, closing his eyes, letting the moment sink in. This was it. They were finally making it. The next few weeks were full of changes. Ryan started his new role officially, and he found himself even more immersed in the company. He was no longer just an assistant, he was part of the team. His responsibilities grew, and so did his confidence. Mr. Thompson continued to mentor him, and Ryan soaked up every bit of knowledge he could, eager to learn, to grow, to prove that he belonged. At the pool, things had changed too. Ryan still worked there during the weekends. He couldn't imagine giving it up entirely. It was where everything had started, where he had found his courage, where he had taken that first leap. Dan was always happy to have him back, and Ryan enjoyed being there, even if it was only part-time now. One Saturday, Ryan was at the pool, sitting in his lifeguard chair, scanning the water as usual. The sun was high, the laughter of children filled the air, and the water sparkled beneath the bright Arizona sky. It was just another day, but it felt different now. Everything felt different, lighter, more hopeful. As Ryan watched the kids playing, he saw Emma running along the edge of the pool, her dad a few steps behind, his eyes on her. Ryan smiled, waving at them. Mr. Thompson waved back, a big grin on his face as he approached the lifeguard chair. "Ryan!" Emma called out, her voice bright with excitement. "Look, I'm wearing my floaties today." Ryan chuckled, giving her a thumbs up. "That's great, Emma. You're ready for the water, huh?" Emma nodded eagerly, then looked up at her dad. "Daddy, can we play in the water now?" Mr. Thompson laughed, nodding. All right. Let's get in the water." He looked up at Ryan, giving him a nod. "Good to see you, Ryan." "Good to see you too, sir," Ryan replied, smiling. Mr. Thompson stepped into the shallow end of the pool, Emma following closely behind. Ryan watched them, his smile lingering. It was moments like this, ordinary, simple moments that made everything worth it. The connection he had made with Emma and Mr. Thompson had turned into something more than he could have imagined. It was more than just a job. It was family. Dan walked over to the base of the chair, looking up at Ryan. "You know, kid," he said, crossing his arms with a grin, "you're the only lifeguard I know who comes back to work after getting a fancy office job." Ryan laughed, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, someone's got to keep an eye on you, right?" Dan chuckled, nodding. "I guess that's true." He looked out at the pool, his expression softening. "You've done a lot here, Ryan. More than most people realize. It's not just about saving lives. It's about making a difference. And you've done that. Not just for Emma, but for everyone here." Ryan looked out at the pool, the laughter and splashing, the families enjoying their time together. He nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest. "Thanks, Dan. That means a lot." Dan patted the side of the chair, smiling up at him. "Keep doing what you're doing, all right? The world needs more people like you." Ryan nodded, his throat tight. He watched as Dan walked away, then looked back out at the water. The day moved on, the sun slowly dipping lower in the sky, the shadows growing longer. Eventually, parents began calling their children out of the water, towels wrapping around small shoulders, families gathering their things. Ryan climbed down from the lifeguard chair, stretching his arms over his head. He looked around the pool area, feeling a sense of peace. The day was ending, but there was something about it that felt complete, like a chapter closing. As he walked out of the gate, he saw Mr. Thompson and Emma waiting near the entrance. Emma's face lit up when she saw Ryan, and she ran over, wrapping her arms around his legs. "Ryan, I wanted to say goodbye," she said, her voice muffled against his jeans. Ryan smiled, kneeling down in front of her. Goodbye, Emma. I'll see you soon, okay? She nodded, then pulled back, giving him a big grin. Mr. Thompson walked over, resting a hand on her shoulder. He looked at Ryan, his expression sincere. Thank you, Ryan, for everything. You've made a bigger difference in our lives than you'll ever know. Ryan nodded, swallowing hard. Thank you, sir. You've given me a chance I never thought I'd have. I'm really grateful. Mr. Thompson extended his hand, and Ryan shook it, feeling the strength of the connection between them. It wasn't just a handshake, it was an understanding, a bond forged through everything they had been through together. Ryan watched as they walked away, Emma's laughter ringing out as she skipped beside her dad. He took a deep breath, looking up at the sky, the first stars just beginning to appear in the twilight. The world felt open, full of possibility. He started walking home, his steps light, his heart full. The struggles, the fear, the uncertainty, it had all led him here. And for the first time, Ryan knew that whatever came next, he was ready for it. He had his mom, he had his new job, he had people who believed in him, and most importantly, he believed in himself. Ryan smiled as he walked, the lights of the city twinkling around him, the sounds of the evening filling the air. He was no longer just a kid from the neighborhood pool. He was someone who had made a difference, who had taken that leap when it mattered most. He was ready for whatever the future held, and he knew that whatever happened, he would face it head on. Because he had learned that real heroes aren't just the ones who wear capes or save the world. They're the ones who show up, who take care of the people around them, who do the right thing even when no one is watching. And that was who Ryan was, and always would be.